Revenge porn affects 9 out of 10 women. It causes immediate, devastating, and often irreversible harm. Victims are frequently threatened with sexual assault, stalked, harassed, fired from jobs, or forced to change schools. It has a huge impact on the mental health of victims, sometimes resulting in suicide. It is important to understand the truth behind revenge porn and move away from victim blaming and towards prosecuting perpetrators with legislation that protects victims from cyber abuse. Hi, I'm Marissa Manech, and you're listening to the Woven Experiences podcast. Here we share stories around important topics and explore the interconnectedness between ourselves and the world around us. Let's get into it. Today's guest is Leah Juliett, a non-binary and queer writer, speaker, organizer, advocate, and the founder and executive director of March Against Revenge Porn, an international nonprofit dedicated to eliminating cyber-sexual exploitation. Welcome to the Woven Experiences podcast. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Lee, for those who are unfamiliar with the term revenge porn, can you just give a short description of what it is?
Sure. Revenge porn is the non-consensual distribution of nude or sexual images or videos. I personally, although I use the term revenge porn frequently, I advocate against it often in the media because it implies that nudity is inherently pornographic, which it is not, and that the victim of the crime did something to warrant revenge, which they did not. So other terms are non-consensual image sharing, image abuse, or cyber exploitation.
Well, that was going to be my next question, because I did, see some of your interviews where you did say revenge porn is the term itself is problematic.
Mm-hmm.
Because, like you said, it implies that the victim did something wrong, which is also, objectifying and dehumanizing women and minorities.
Exactly. Nudity does not pornography make. And I think when people hear the term porn, they automatically associate it with something taboo or something bad. But really, this is a crime that gets committed against victims of sexual exploitation. So we really should try to change the term. I use the term in the title of my organization as a foot in the door method because so many people know what revenge porn is. But once they start talking to us, we advocate for the use of other terminology.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, less people would be likely to Google cyber sexual exploitation because, doing that immediately triggers that you're doing something wrong. This is something in the same realm as child pornography. So I definitely think a shift of language is necessary.
Absolutely.
So your activism stems from your experience as a victim of cyber sexual exploitation.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to ask you to go into that. If people want to know, there are hundreds of interviews and articles where you do cover your experience. But I was curious of what kind of support did you expect to receive when it happened? And what was the actual reality of the kind of support you received?
When I was a young teenager and this happened to me, I didn't expect to receive any support because I had witnessed young girls who had sent nude photos of themselves to others being arrested in my high school and in my middle school. So if anything, I expected to be arrested similarly.
Are you serious?
Yes, I'm serious. I distinctly remember watching a police officer take a girl in a grade older than me out of school because she had sent nude pictures, and so she was being I don't know if it was charged with child pornography. Either way, she got in trouble with the local police And I was terrified of that. So I didn't expect to have any support. And unfortunately, I didn't have any support. The only support I had was from my best friend, Tom, who was the only person who knew that this was happening to me. There were no teachers, no administrators, no law enforcement, no lawyers, no parents who knew what was happening to me. So I virtually had no support except for my friend. I fully relied on myself to be the source of support for my own existence, and it was incredibly hard.
That is an incredible burden. How did it impact you?
It impacted me incredibly negatively, I would say. I already had undiagnosed mental health issues. I've been living with depression and anxiety for and OCD for the majority of my life, but it really exacerbated those mental health issues. I became suicidal. I became even more depressed. I developed post traumatic stress. I really lived in my own shame, and I believed that I didn't deserve anything good, any accomplishment, any reward, because I felt it was my fault and that I had done something wrong.
So, it's a very isolating experience from what I understand.
hmm
What challenges do victims face if they do decide to take action?
Oh, I mean, first of all, most victims don't report being victimized due to, distrust of the police, distrust of law enforcement, fear of getting in trouble, fear of being labeled a child pornographer. So to start with, no one, many victims don't come forward, but the victims who do, and who thus make up the statistic that 10 million internet users in the United States are victimized, they face immense victim blaming. Even in our law enforcement. In our law enforcement systems here in the United States and in our legal system, we don't have federal legislation criminalizing this, mainly because the legal system blames the victim for sending the pictures in the first place. So they have the potential to deal with further victim blaming by legislative means and by law enforcement. They have the potential to deal with blame from their community, blame from their family, blame from even the perpetrator. And also, a lot of the laws that are currently in each state in the United States require that the victim um, prove that the perpetrator had the intent to harm, meaning that the perpetrator intended to harm the victim. And that's incredibly difficult because the burden of proof is on the victim to prove that the perpetrator purposely meant to harm them, and it's very hard to do that. So there's a lot of difficulty that comes with being a victim, a lot of difficulty that comes with speaking out. um, but I encourage anyone who feels that they are safe and it's accessible for them to come and speak out and tell their story to do so, because it lifts an immense weight and burden off of their shoulders.
And you mentioned in an interview with CNN, with your march against revenge porn, as you say, the foot in the door,
Yeah.
that these marches are there to kind of strike up the conversation. Uh, just from your previous answer, these stigmas and things like that, shame, is that one of some of the things that stand in the way of having these conversations, or why wouldn't these conversations be had before?
Yeah, so I founded March Against Revenge Porn because I knew from being a student of political science that every civil rights movement in the United States that's ever been successful has started with grassroots, boots on the ground activism, taking to the streets and protesting. And the main implication of being a victim of revenge porn is being exposed in public. So many victims of revenge porn feel afraid to go out in public and have their face shown, have their body on display, because their body has been on display on the internet. So I think that the main way to reclaim that shame is by, you know, taking to the streets, being public, being visible, being legible, and saying, no matter what you do, no matter what you say about me, no matter how you try to steal my body, I'm going to exist in the public sphere and be okay. And I think that that's very powerful. At March Against Revenge Porn, we don't believe or we don't subscribe to the idea of shamelessness. I don't believe that anyone is fully shameless because we all as humans have shame, and having shame is nothing to be ashamed of. Instead, I believe in reclamation of that shame, taking that shame and using it to do something constructive, to help people, to start dialogues. And that's what we're doing at March Against Revenge Porn. Revenge porn is so taboo, it's under discussed, and when it is discussed, it's discussed in ways that are dehumanizing and degrading for the victims. So by taking to the streets, we're sparking conversations in the media and in our communities about this issue, which disproportionately victimizes women and targets people across the board. So I think it's incredibly important that we're taking to the streets and we're starting these dialogues.
Is there a lot of confrontation or resistance when you bring up these type of topics to talk about? Whether it might not be in a situation where you're doing a talk or an interview, but perhaps in a casual setting.
Yeah, I've been very fortunate that the majority of people who I've spoken in front of or spoken to have been very understanding and empathetic to the cause. However, it's usually strangers on the internet who hide behind the cloak of anonymity and who comment on the news articles that I'm featured in or the interviews that are published of me, who say very cruel, mean, harmful things, calling me a child pornographer for sending my own naked photos, calling me fat and ugly, saying that this is an issue that, should only happened because of my own fault, that I'm to blame. So while I don't get much hate or controversy or a combative nature from anyone face to face, I definitely get it online. But when I get these mean comments, I believe that it really proves why I'm doing the work that I'm doing, that people feel as if they can hide behind a computer screen and do and say cruel things. And I'm setting out to prove that if you do that, you will face repercussions. It's not only going to be legal, it's not only going to be social, but you're going to be held accountable exactly by victims of your crimes, of your cruelty, telling their stories and having a voice.
Should tech companies be held accountable if their platform or apps are being used to get, to distribute, or host forms of cyber exploitation? Because right now, there's been a lot of issues coming up.
Yeah, I definitely believe that tech companies should be held accountable. They are hosting this content on their platforms. I can give you an example. When I was a teenager and I had my nude photos on the internet, there was an Instagram page that was created called Woolkit Sluts. Woolkit was the town that I grew up in. And a boy in my high school made an Instagram page where he posted everyone's nudes. Fortunately, the page got taken down before mine were posted, but I lived in terror every second that my photos were going to be posted on this much more accessible public page. Anon IB is very public, but Instagram is so much more public and accessible. It took about 24 hours for the page to be taken down, and it featured pictures of children and teenagers. So I absolutely think that sites like Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, 4chan, they all need to be held accountable for promoting this material on their sites, for not getting them taken down quick enough, for not trusting victims when they come forward and say that, their non-consensual images are being hosted on their sites. Without these sites, the pictures wouldn't exist. They wouldn't have a landing page. So it's absolutely the responsibility of the tech companies to take a stand against non-consensual imagery, and to advocate for victims, not side with perpetrators.
Perpetrators, some of them were past intimate partners that gain access to this type of private information and pictures and so on. But that's not necessarily the only way perpetrators get information these days.
Right. There's so many ways that perpetrators can commit crimes of cybersexual exploitation. One way is hacking. People can hack into your computer, hack into your webcam, get images of you, videos of you undressing, things like that, in which case the victim has absolutely no connection to the perpetrator. Um, Individuals can record you at, for instance, a party. If you are engaging in a sexual act with someone, they could have hidden cameras. I know people who've been recorded whilst being assaulted, which is just absolutely horrific.
That's terrible.
Right. And it can also be as simple as sharing an intimate photo of yourself and then having that photo disseminated, like in my case. So there's a wide variety of ways that this can happen. For another way is that, you can create a nude photo or a nude piece of art for the purposes of art. Like my associate director, Belinda Berry, that happened to her in her story. And then that art was disseminated beyond her control without her permission. And so there's a lot of different ways that this can happen, but no matter what way it happened to you, you're still justified in your anger. You're still justified in coming forward and identifying as a victim or as a survivor. There's no one way that this happens to victims, and everyone is deserving of justice under law.
No, of course. With tech evolving, hackers getting access to cloud accounts, and many people finding their faces deep faked onto pornographic imagery or video,
Right.
where do you draw the line between what is considered revenge porn or what is defamation, even if this humiliation experience is the same?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm not an expert on deepfakes. I can point you into the direction of some folks who are, but in my personal opinion, non-consensual image sharing means that an image was shared without your consent, and it may humiliate you, it may cause you harm. It doesn't have to, but it might do that, and I think that deepfakes certainly cause harm. I think that they turn your face into a sexual image. So even if that body isn't yours, I personally think that the harm that it causes, the sexualizing and pornographizing your face by adding it to a naked body, is incredibly harmful. So I definitely think it can be considered a form of cyber exploitation, a form of image abuse. Whether it falls under the category of non-consensual image sharing, I'm not sure. But again, I'm not an expert in deepfakes. I personally think it should count, because the harm is all the same.
Yeah, talking about harm, in your TEDx talk, you mentioned that cyber violence and physical violence are both sides of the same coin.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think the abuse and hate speech we find online is a reflection of what's happening in the physical world?
Absolutely. I think, first of all, I think that individuals are empowered by anonymity. They feel more, they have more access to their own cruelty by hiding behind a computer screen. So while they may not say the same cruel words in real life that they say online, they certainly think them. Those thoughts are certainly there. So the accessibility to harm is right there. I personally believe that if someone commits a cyber act, a cyber crime, then they will be more empowered to commit a physical crime if they're not held accountable. It happened in my case. It happens every day. Cyber violence is just a stone's throw away from physical violence. And if someone is empowered to hurt someone online, they're really just a hop, skip, and a jump away from hurting someone in real life. So they need to be held accountable, through through legislation, through social impacts, and by not being able to perform that cruel act in person or on the internet without repercussions.
Currently, Only 48 states in the US have revenge porn laws. These laws, however, differ from state to state. South Africa has laws against revenge porn. Revenge porn in South Africa is defined as knowingly distributing sexual photos or videos without consent of any individual featured, sharing it publicly with the intention to cause harm or distress, uploading private sexual photos where the person can be clearly identified or is named in any accompanying text. Perpetrators committing the basic offenses, which means not naming the person in the photo or the person cannot be identified, will come with a max jail sentence of 2 years and a fine of 150,000 Rand, which is about $908 US dollars. Or, if the victim can be identified, the sentence is doubled to 4 years and the fine to 300,000 Rand. Many countries have expanded existing legislation, such as the Cyberbullying Act in Canada, was extended so that the law can be applied to victims of revenge porn. Or, like France, that already has privacy protections in place which can be applied to revenge porn. Other countries have developed or are developing legislation of their own. Israel's penalties are some of the strictest, with up to 5 years in jail. But will this be enough? Now, you've mentioned legislation, against revenge porn being different from state to state in the US. Why is federal revenge porn law needed?
That's a great question. Well, I live in the state of Connecticut, and up until last year, cyber exploitation, unlawful dissemination of an intimate image was considered a misdemeanor. A misdemeanor in the state of Connecticut, I believe, gets $1,000 fine and up to a year in jail. If someone ruins your life for the rest of your life from having a nude image on the internet, and they only have to pay $1,000 to get their own life back, I think that that's fundamentally unfair. And then we hop state lines and we go to another state like New York or Minnesota where it's a felony and the fines are increased, the penalties are increased, the jail time is increased, and someone who commits the same crime is held to a different standard legislatively and criminally. And I think that that's fundamentally unfair. Victims who go through the same thing should be able to get the same justice regardless of where they live. Just because I happened to live in Connecticut when I was victimized doesn't mean that I deserve less justice than someone who happens to live in Minnesota when they're victimized, just because Minnesota has stronger laws. So by creating a federal law in the United States, we have legislation that affects and impacts everyone regardless of state. It holds true for someone whether they live in Connecticut, whether they live in Texas, California, Minnesota, Kansas, etc. So I believe that federal legislation is necessary to ensure that everyone has equal access to justice. And it also sets a precedent. When the United States Congress says that this crime needs, a legislative approach, a legislative solution, they're raising awareness and starting conversations and advocating for this crime as a crime. For so long, I think folks talk about revenge porn in advocacy spaces. We talk about revenge porn in social justice spaces, and it's a very modern topic to discuss. But in the congressional space, it's far less discussed and far more stigmatized. So I think that by having legislation federally and bringing this to the floor of the United States Congress, it will really cause a shift for what's considered a crime and really start a more fruitful dialogue that will, in the end, benefit victims by discouraging perpetrators from committing the crime because they know that there's legislation regardless of where they live.
There's an existing federal law protecting children from cyber sexual exploitation. It's not a far reach to extend the law to include all the victims. Why has that not been considered?
I don't have an answer that I think is concrete, but I have an opinion. My personal opinion is that um, children's brains aren't fully formed yet, and I think the decisions that children make are far less stigmatized. Children can be manipulated and abused into um, certain vulnerable positions. And so I think that there's a lot more sympathy for when this happens to children than when it happens to adults, because
Mm.
folks who don't understand what it's like to be pressured to send pictures, folks who don't understand what it's like to be in an intimate setting with someone and want to share a picture, they are more encouraged, or they're more easily apt to blame someone for sending that picture, to blame someone for taking that photo. If they're an adult and they have a fully functioning, fully formed decision making process in their brain than if they're a young child. So I think that society in general is much more willing to protect children who are more vulnerable than they are to empathize with an adult who may fall victim to something and who are also vulnerable in different ways. I think we just are much more willing to stigmatize and to victim blame adults when they fall victim to a crime than children.
It's not a fair world. But your activism is centered around educating people with your
Mm-hmm.
TEDx talk, with your cyber community chats on YouTube, your interviews, articles, and you are currently also Miss Greater Rockville.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you decide to take an educational approach?
Um, I won't pretend to have all the answers. I'm only 23 years old. I want to go to law school. I have educated myself completely on my own, with the help of, advocates and professors who I've studied. I've educated myself on my own. And I think that there is far too little information out there about this crime, far too little information out there for victims. When I first was victimized, when I was a young teenager, I looked up, nude pictures were posted online. What do I do? And the only information that came up for me was stories of victims who'd committed suicide, um, threads of victims talking about how they lost their job, they lost their schooling, and people whose lives were generally, ruined because of this crime. There was no information that said what to do about it. There was no information that said you can survive it. There was no, talks or interviews with victims who had lived through it. I wanted to be that source of information for people. I wanted to not only share my story, but the stories of others, because I think it's so important to have stories of people who've lived through it as opposed to only stories of people who've died because of it. Um, and also, I think I offer an interesting perspective as a queer, non binary, asexual person who has been victimized and who was victimized as a young person. I think I offer an interesting perspective, because my story is different than the stories of others. Everyone's story is different, but I've been really fortunate to be put in the position to serve as an educator, and I'll never claim to have all the answers. I'll never claim that all of my answers are right. They generally stem from my experiences and how I've educated myself. But I do think we need a lot more education about this issue, and I am happy to start laying the foundation of education, um, and hope that in the future, universities and high schools and middle schools and K-12 will start with comprehensive cyber sex ed, so that way we teach young people, we teach adults about these crimes, and we really spark more dialogues through education.
You do make yourself very vulnerable online and in articles, sharing your experience. Doesn't that take a toll, or has it become part of what you do every day?
it definitely takes a toll. I'd be lying if I said that it's easy to rehash my own trauma every day, or at least several times a week. But for me, it's worth it. There's a quote that I use a lot by Morley, who's a street artist based in Los Angeles, and it's, "I was once saved by the worst thing that ever happened to me." Advocating for victims' rights gives me a purpose. It gives me a reason to wake up and to, face my own personal demons. It's certainly hard to grapple with. It certainly does cause me, stress and trauma, but it all feels worth it to me because I'm helping others. When I get an email or a message talking about, how I helped someone or how my story meant something to someone, it reminds me that I'm doing this for a reason. And even when, there are long periods where I don't get that validation, I know in my heart that sharing my story means something to my younger self who didn't have a voice. So I'm doing it on her behalf as well. So while it does take a toll, it definitely is worth it in the end because I have a voice that I didn't have before.
Well, you were planning a very ambitious year at the end of 2019 for 2020. You were planning to take March Against Revenge Porn on marches all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
How has your activism changed in light of COVID-19?
Well, our organization is known for doing physical protest marches. That's certainly not all of what we do, but it's what we're known for. It's in our title. And because of COVID-19, we weren't able to do any marches in 2020, which will be the first year since our founding that we weren't able to do any marches. However, we're coming back with a bang. And in 2021, we have 3 marches planned, one in Washington, D.C. in March, one in Los Angeles, probably in the summer, and one in Minneapolis, probably in the fall, although the dates haven't been nailed down yet and secured. So we have 3 marches. They all have to stay in the United States at this moment because of COVID, although we were hoping to expand internationally. But in the meantime, we are going international through our podcast series, March Against Revenge Porn, March Across America, where we will be sharing the stories of victims of cyber exploitation from all 50 states and abroad. We're just trying to share as many stories as possible within the year to amplify the idea that victimization looks different and not all crimes are the same, and legislation is needed to ensure that everyone gets justice. We're also starting a new legal defense fund, which is generously funded by L'Oreal Paris, who's giving us a $10,000 donation, which we are using not only to hold marches, but to give $500 grants to folks seeking legal justice. Because so many people, myself included, have wanted to, set up a first meeting with a lawyer to find out what their legal options are, but it costs $500 an hour and they can't afford it. We're paying that initial $500 fee. All you have to do to apply is go to our website, marchagainstrevengeporn.org, and click on Legal Defense Fund. You apply, and we will get back to you and hopefully definitely get those funds to you by 2021. We have a lot of other projects happening, a lot of exciting things going on. Like you said, I'm Miss Greater Rockville, so I will hopefully be involved in the Miss America organization talking about this, which I think is very important. So we are expanding. We are doing a lot of cyber work, more cyber work than we were able to do physical work because of COVID. But we're still here. We're still loud. We're still unapologetic, and I'm really excited about what's to come.
Well, you have quite a few things going on, and lots to come, as you say. But what is your focus right now?
My focus right now, probably. I was recently honored on last Monday, the 19th of October, by L'Oreal Paris as one of their 2020 Women of Worth. And that means that L'Oreal is recognizing me for my work fighting revenge porn and, like I said, giving us a $10,000 donation. But also, we have the ability to win an additional $25,000 by having the general public vote. So right now I'm really trying to get the word out, trying to do press, trying to write op-eds to get the word out so we can get that additional $25,000. Imagine we would be able to give with $25,000, we'd be able to give 50 grants of $500 to folks to start their legal defense journeys. And we're also raising money. So at any time, you can donate on our website to our legal defense fund so we can, give as many grants to people as possible. So really trying to raise money and trying to raise awareness. The voting goes until November 27th. We also have an NBC special, an NBC primetime special coming out on November 25th, which will tell my story and the story of March Against Revenge Porn. So we've been working on filming that, and you can catch that on NBC primetime the day before Thanksgiving here in the United States. I'm not sure if it's premiering all over the world, but you can definitely watch it on Peacock, which is NBC's online streaming service. So there's a lot of really exciting things going on. And we're very fortunate at March Against Revenge Porn to have had so many opportunities, and I'm incredibly fortunate as well.
Well, I'll definitely be tagging as many of those events coming up and all the information. Now, South Africa is kind of still developing. The majority of people are now only gaining access to broadband internet for the first time. Do you have any words of wisdom for first-time internet users?
That's an excellent question. The first time I was ever interviewed about revenge porn, it was in 2016, and it was on the BBC radio. And I said something that I regret because I'm learning and I'm growing, and there will always be things that I say that I might not agree with 3 years later. And I said, don't share something that you wouldn't want put on a billboard because you never know what's going to happen. And that image may end up on a billboard. It may end up in the hands of someone that you don't want it to. I regret that now because I think that puts the burden of determining, I think that puts the burden on the victim of, ensuring that they are not victimized. And I think that that's wrong. I would say for first-time internet users, educate yourself as much as you can, as much as accessible to you about what your rights are, because you have the right, if you're over the age of 18, if you're an adult, to send intimate images. You have the right to exist in your home and do what you please. You have those rights. However, other folks with malicious intentions or who want to harm may do so. And if that happens, be aware of what your rights are. I'm not sure of what legislation exists in Africa. I'm not sure of what rights do exist for folks in South Africa at this present moment. However, I would just say be as aware as possible about what your options are in case something does happen. I think telling young people, telling adults not to send nude images puts a bandage on a much bigger wound. Instead, we should be educating our youth about how to text safely, about what can potentially happen to them, and about what their options are. So that way, if it does happen, they don't turn to suicide. They don't turn to, running away from home. They don't turn to any dangerous acts of self-harm because they feel like they're alone. You're not alone. And so I think being as aware about your options, knowing who can advocate for you, having open dialogues with your parents, having, open dialogues with your family about internet usage and sexual violence is important because you want to be as well equipped as possible in case something does happen.
Well, thank you so much, Lee. And thank you so much for giving so much of your time, especially on a Saturday. It's truly appreciated.
Of course. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you telling these important stories. I'm very grateful to be included.
I have included links to Leah's website and Instagram, as well as links to March Against Revenge Porn and their podcast, March Across America. Make sure to learn more about Leah, and most importantly, vote for them in L'Oreal's Women of Worth before the 27th of November. And that's a wrap. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode, and be sure to subscribe to this podcast to avoid missing out on any future episodes. I'd appreciate it if you could leave a review, and if you have any thoughts on today's episode or perhaps topics you would like me to touch on, you can contact me via email. A link is provided in the description. I hope today's episode provided some new insights to what it means to be human, and I hope to see you in the next one.